This is A History of Oil, Episode 3, The Finger Snappers. Last time on A History of Oil, Colonel E. L. Drake punched a hole 68 feet into Oil Creek and set off the Pennsylvania oil rush. The race for oil was now fully underway. Once word had spread that the Yankee struck oil, northwestern Pennsylvania's oil region was quickly overwhelmed by land speculators, drillers, teamsters, moonshiners, carpenters, women of ill repute, and practically anyone else hoping to profit in some way from the oil boom. By April 1861, yes, the very same month that South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, drillers in Oil Creek struck their first gushing well, and a fountain of high-pressure oil erupted into the air. In short order, Pennsylvania's first oil gusher also became the state's very first oil well fire, after the combustible mixture of oil, air, and natural gas found a spark. 19 people were killed, and the fire burned for 3 days. When the flames were finally extinguished, the Empire Well, as it would become known, produced a whopping 3,000 barrels of oil a day. In fact, the timing of the Civil War is significant because it had a major impact on the formation of the early oil industry. Prior to the war, the South had been a major producer of turpentine, a source for one of oil's biggest competitors in the home lighting market. Remember camphene, the stuff that had a tendency to blow up in your face? Well, the South was a major producer of turpentine and therefore camphene. But the Civil War had turned the turpentine business upside down, and the market share for oil had space to expand even more. And finally, prices began to rise along with demand. In fact, by September of 1863, the price of a barrel of oil topped around $140, give or take, in today's money. This was a very lucrative business. In fact, one famous well returned $15,000 in profit for every dollar invested. That's right, a 15,000% return on investment. With so much money to be made, the population of hardscrabble communities in and around the oil region first doubled and then tripled in size as Oil Creek rapidly became the epicenter of oil. They called it Oildom, the great Oildorado, or simply Petrolia, and for good reason. Of all of the oil produced in the United States by the end of the 1860s, 94% of it came from Pennsylvania, and 72% of that oil came from Venango County, home of Oil Creek. Soon, the region became so packed with people that S.J.M. Eaton, an early chronicler of the oil boom, would remark that it was hard to discern where one town ended and the other began. So thickly strewn is the entire valley with a dense and active population. In one boomtown known as Petroleum Center, just south of Titusville, the wells are crowded as thickly as houses. Dwellings and engine houses were mixed up in such confusion that it is difficult to distinguish one from the other without entering, and not always then. In many ways, Pennsylvania's oil rush had a lot in common with the frenzied excitement of the California gold rush just 12 years earlier. Everything was up for grabs. What was really interesting about this new oil rush, something which separated it from gold or silver, which had been mined for millennia, was that the oil business was an entirely new frontier. In fact, few people fully understood subterranean geology or the best methods for extracting oil. This lack of scientific understanding about oil, well, it was matched in spades by the wild inefficiencies in producing it. Along the banks of Oil Creek, the early technique for producing oil was generally the same. A leaseholder would buy the rights to a small strip of land. If a well struck oil, steam engines powered the pumps which directed the oil through a series of spigots into a holding tank. Sometimes the crude oil was refined directly on site. Otherwise, it was funneled into barrels or stored on barges and skiffs along the banks of Oil Creek. Leaking oil was considered to be an unavoidable part of the process, and it was everywhere. Huge quantities of oil pooled on the ground or flowed directly into the river. The advent of hillside drilling cleared off more vegetation from the bluffs above, and when it rained, the runoff of oil, dirt, and debris from the oil camps made Oil Creek a toxic mess. It was a sight to behold. As one visitor remarked at the time, the river is dark and a scum of oil glistens on its surface. There was so much oil flowing down Oil Creek that some entrepreneurs didn't even need to drill. Instead, they built little berms downstream and paid young women, but not young men for some reason, to scoop up the excess in oil that they could collect in tin cups. As a consequence of all of this oil, fire was an ever present threat. In fact, Petroleum Center would burn to the ground on several occasions, but each time it was rebuilt again and again. In 1863, a lantern shattered on an oil barge laying at anchor among 400 other oil barges near Oil City. As the fire spread from one boat fully loaded with oil to the next, someone cut the boats loose. The flaming boats sailed downstream, carried by the current, igniting all of the other oil on the river's surface and spread the conflagration from one bank to the other. Oil Creek had become a burning river of crude. Now, for producers who were further upstream, their problem wasn't so much a burning river of oil, but the challenges associated with just getting their product to market. Early on in the oil rush, the teamsters established a iron monopoly on the roads and charged crippling fees for overland transport. Rail lines were still under construction, and so producers used mules and horses to pull boats laden with oil downstream. As one writer from the Boston Journal noted, it was painful to witness the exertions of these poor brutes, nor do we wonder at seeing the floating remains of several that had died in harness. Still, there were only so many mules you could work to death along Oil Creek. A better method for transporting the crude to market had to be found. As an ingenious and possibly insane solution to their transportation problem, the early oil pioneers hit upon an idea. They could create man made flash floods called freshets and just sail their oil downriver. It worked for moving logs. Why not oil? The idea took root, and very soon producers along Oil Creek were paying regular fees for each man made flood. These fees paid for specially built dams upstream, and at a set time and date, a full time superintendent would direct his men to break open the dams and release the water. This would send a roaring torrent of water down the valley. During the height of the oil boom in the 1860s, there were at least 2 freshets a week, and sometimes more. On the river, boatmen were assigned to barges and tasked with riding the deluge down to Oil City. They had poles to guide their craft, but mostly the goal was just to hang on for dear life. Their job wasn't so much to navigate the twists and turns of the raging river, but to protect the cargo from being stolen once it arrived, if it arrived. As the historian Brian Black writes, freshets were many things: dangerous, exciting, and resourceful, but efficiency could not be counted among their attributes. No matter how successful the freshet trip, 1/3 of the oil was lost to leakage even before the boats were launched. Another third of the oil seeped out before ever reaching Pittsburgh. All of this frenzied greed and inefficiency certainly attracted the notice of contemporaries. In 1865, New York Times journalist William Wright visited the oil region. Companies and individuals must eventually pay the penalty, he wrote, of establishing conditions in which the lowest form of selfishness is the only recognized principle for action. The influx of capital into the oil region has been so unprecedented that Some of its people may have imagined that they can snap their fingers at the natural laws. These will, in the end, assuredly vindicate themselves. Wright's prediction was more accurate than he could have known. The all or nothing quest for oil and the havoc it reaped on the people and natural environment of Oil Creek could not be sustained. Far away in Cleveland, Ohio, a local goods grocer had just discovered how much money could be made in the refining business. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and he was about to impose some order on the chaos and put the squeeze on the finger snappers in Oildorado. This is a history of oil.